This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The small town of Brookhaven, Florida, nestled between sprawling orange groves and the quiet buzz of suburban life, had always been a place where everyone seemed to know everyone. The schools, although diverse in student population, operated like microcosms of the larger societal dynamics, where hidden tensions simmered beneath the surface. In Brookhaven Middle School, this tension was more palpable than anywhere else. Most of the kids who walked through the doors every morning seemed to float through life, following the worn routines of adolescence, cliques forming around common interests, arguments over petty issues, and friendships quickly broken or made. But beneath it all, there was a deep undercurrent of division. It wasn't just about popularity or academic achievement, it was about race, privilege, and a history that no one dared to discuss. Rachel Williams was one of those kids who, despite being only 11, carried an air of silent certainty that seemed to settle around her like a cloak. She wasn't particularly tall for her age, nor was she unusually beautiful, but there was something about her presence that commanded attention. Maybe it was the way she held her head high, as if she could see over the heads of everyone else, as though she were always a few steps ahead in some unseen race. Or maybe it was the sharpness of her gaze, cold and unyielding, like a predator sizing up her prey. Whatever it was, Rachel knew how to make herself noticed in the hallways, in the classrooms, and even in the cafeteria. She had always been an outsider, but that was by design. She wasn't like the other girls. While they fawned over the latest trends or giggled about boys, Rachel's interests leaned more toward the ideological. She devoured books on history, politics, and above all, social structures, specifically, those that divided people by race. Her home life played a large role in this. Rachel's father, Daniel Williams, was a police officer with a storied career, often lauded for his no-nonsense approach to law enforcement. He had raised Rachel to believe in certain principles: respect for authority, the importance of discipline, and a strict adherence to the idea that certain people were simply not good enough. It was an ideology that seemed to seep into their household every day, reinforced by the stories Daniel told of his work, of the trouble that always seemed to follow certain types of people. Her mother, Sarah, was less overt but equally influential. A regular attendee at town meetings and local political rallies, Sarah often spoke about the decay of traditional values and the need to preserve the sanctity of their community. She had raised Rachel to see the world through a lens that was sharply divided into categories of worth, where certain groups, in Sarah's view, simply didn't belong. Rachel had never questioned these teachings; they were the truths of her life, woven into the very fabric of her identity. Brookhaven Middle School was a place Rachel had learned to navigate with precision. The school was predominantly white, but there were enough Black and Hispanic students to make things interesting, as her father would say. The tension between these groups was subtle at first, little more than an occasional glance, an unspoken word here or there, but Rachel could see it, feel it in the air. She noticed how the Black kids, especially the ones who had moved to Brookhaven from larger cities, stuck together in tight-knit groups. They walked through the hallways in clusters, heads held low, eyes often darting around, wary of the white students who seemed to be ever watchful. Rachel didn't understand them, but she didn't need to. She knew her place, and that place was above them. She was smarter, better, more deserving of everything they were not. It was in the cafeteria that Rachel first began to make a name for herself. She had chosen a seat at one of the farthest corners of the room, away from the noise and bustle, where she could observe everything. She didn't care much for the food. She had never been a fan of cafeteria pizza or soggy salads. What she cared about was the theater of it all. The way the students divided themselves into their cliques, the way the Black kids gathered near the windows, their voices low and filled with an air of secrecy. Rachel had always been curious, but her curiosity had never been born out of understanding. It was a curiosity born of superiority, of wanting to know how the other side lived so she could measure their flaws, their weaknesses. The group of Black students that caught her attention the most was a small collective of 13 kids. They were different from the others, she thought. They were louder, bolder, more defiant. It was as though they wore their difference like a badge of honor, unashamed of who they were. Derek, the leader of the group, was the one who stood out to her the most. Tall and with an easy smile, Derek seemed to carry a quiet confidence that Rachel couldn't quite understand. He wasn't afraid of her, and that irked her more than anything. In the few times their paths had crossed, he had spoken to her with a casualness that felt almost disrespectful. He didn't follow the rules the way the others did, and that was something Rachel could not tolerate. She began to notice the way he and his friends walked with an unspoken sense of unity. They didn't make an effort to fit in; instead, they created their own space, one that was separate, distinct, and completely foreign to Rachel's understanding. Her observations of them became more frequent, more obsessive. She watched the way they laughed together, the way their conversations flowed with ease, while the white students, like her, often seemed fractured and tense, as though constantly measuring their worth against the unseen scale of society's expectations. Rachel could feel her resentment growing. The more she watched Derek and his friends, the more she saw them as a challenge to everything she had been taught to believe. They were a threat. No, they were the threat. They didn't conform. They didn't respect the hierarchy of power that Rachel had been raised to revere. And in her mind, that made them dangerous. But it wasn't just Derek, it was the whole group. The way they walked through the halls as if they owned the space, the way they spoke to teachers with an air of entitlement Rachel could never have imagined for herself. It gnawed at her, an uncomfortable sensation that lodged itself deep within her, like a splinter that refused to be removed. Rachel felt her worldview shaking, trembling, the foundation of everything she had known slipping away as she came to grips with an unsettling truth: they didn't need her approval. In the quiet, solitary moments when Rachel sat in her room, staring out of the window at the bright Florida sky, she would replay the day's events in her mind. She would imagine herself in control of the situation, in control of them. She would envision herself walking through the hallways, not as the girl who had to watch her every move, but as the one who others watched, no, feared. She fantasized about the power she could wield, the way she could force things back into the order she knew, the one that made sense. A world where people knew their place. And then, on one fateful afternoon, the moment arrived. Derek, that infuriating boy, stood in front of her, his voice cutting through the hum of the school, challenging her worldview in front of the whole cafeteria. It was as if all the years of unspoken hate, the years of indoctrination, the years of simmering anger, all boiled over in that single moment. And Rachel knew that something would have to change. The question was, what would she do about it? Brookhaven Middle School stood as an imposing, crumbling monument to a place caught between time, history, and the shifting currents of change. The air was thick with the weight of expectations that were drilled into the students from an early age. Its yellow brick walls and long, echoing hallways had seen generations of children grow up. But underneath the facade of academic pursuit, there was an undercurrent of tension. The kind of tension that lingered just beneath the surface, festering in the quiet, unnoticed corners of the school. The kind of tension that made itself known only when you weren't paying attention, when you were too busy focusing on what the world wanted you to see. The school was a place where division seemed to come naturally. It wasn't just about the usual distinctions: sports kids, band kids, and the theater crowd. It went deeper than that. It was about who you were, where you came from, and most importantly, the color of your skin. Brookhaven was diverse, at least on paper. But that diversity was often more of an illusion, a smokescreen that hid the unspoken realities of life in a town that had never truly embraced the idea of unity. The racial divide at Brookhaven Middle School was a quiet one, but no less sharp for being so subtle. The students were segregated not by physical barriers, but by invisible ones: social norms, whispered prejudices, and the echo of histories that had yet to be reconciled. Rachel had always been keenly aware of the separation. She didn't need to see it in the cafeteria to know it was there. It was in the way the teachers would smile a little too brightly at the white students, their eyes lingering just a moment longer on their papers. It was in the way the black students seemed to keep to themselves, their voices low, their laughter shared only among those who understood the code. Rachel noticed these things because she had been trained to notice. Her father had taught her how to read people, how to understand the subtle cues that told you where you stood. And for as long as Rachel could remember, she had always stood at the top of the social ladder. She had always been able to look down at the others, those who were different, those who didn't quite belong. But what Rachel didn't understand, what no one in her family had ever explained to her, was that the boundaries of this world she had constructed were not as solid as she believed. The black kids at Brookhaven weren't like the others. They had a kind of unspoken solidarity, a quiet bond that Rachel found both infuriating and fascinating. They weren't like the other students, the ones who came from families of old money or those whose parents were well-known names in the town. These kids had come from somewhere else, somewhere they didn't quite belong. Some were from larger cities, others from neighborhoods that seemed a world away from the manicured lawns of Brookhaven. They were immigrants or children of immigrants, the descendants of people who had lived through the struggles of poverty, of systemic racism, of a world that told them they were never meant to rise above their station. But still they did. And that infuriated Rachel more than anything else. They made it look so effortless. They carried themselves with a confidence that Rachel could never quite wrap her mind around. They laughed louder, spoke more freely, and lived with an ease that seemed to say they didn't care what anyone thought of them. It was an audacity that she could neither understand nor tolerate. At lunch, the cafeteria was a microcosm of the larger world outside. The long rows of tables were divided not by any official rules, but by an unspoken order that everyone understood without question. The black students sat in their own section, a cluster of bodies that seemed to radiate a kind of defiance that made the other students uncomfortable. They sat in groups of 3s and 4s, always in the same spots, always in the same arrangement, as if their proximity to one another was a comfort that no one could understand. Rachel could see them from her seat at the back of the room, the way they leaned in close to each other, their faces animated with the kind of shared history that Rachel could never touch. There was a warmth to their group that made her feel cold in comparison. The way they moved in harmony, as though they had created a world of their own within the walls of the school. It was a world Rachel could never be a part of. Rachel's table, on the other hand, was always filled with her kind, those who came from families like hers. The children of police officers, doctors, business owners, and politicians. They were the ones who followed the rules, who spoke in hushed tones when the teachers walked by, who laughed quietly and waited for their turn to speak. They were the ones who had everything handed to them on a silver platter, and yet they still struggled to find a sense of belonging. The air around their table was thick with politeness, with the kind of conversation that was never too real, never too bold. It was the kind of conversation Rachel had grown up with, the kind of conversation that never really went anywhere, that danced around topics without ever truly touching them. They talked about grades, about the latest fashion trends, about the newest celebrity gossip. They avoided the hard topics, the topics that made people uncomfortable. They avoided anything that might threaten the delicate balance of their little world. It wasn't that Rachel didn't want to interact with the black kids. In fact, there were moments when she felt a strange pull toward them, a curiosity that she couldn't quite shake. She found herself watching them from across the room, studying the way they moved together, how they communicated without words, how they seemed to live in a world that was separate from the one Rachel knew. But those moments were fleeting. Whenever Rachel caught herself thinking about them, she quickly shoved the thoughts away, burying them beneath the weight of her own arrogance. They were different, she told herself. They were not like her. They were the other, the people who didn't belong in the world she had built for herself. The black students, in turn, seemed to ignore Rachel's presence altogether. They didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her. They didn't need to. To them, Rachel was just another part of the background noise that filled the hallways, another face in the crowd of students who had never bothered to understand their lives. Derek, the leader of the group, was the only one who ever seemed to take notice of her. He had a way of looking at her with an expression that bordered on amusement, as if he could see through the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself. There were times when Rachel caught him watching her, his gaze steady and unblinking, and it unsettled her. It was as though he could see the cracks in her facade, the uncertainty that lurked just beneath her skin, and that bothered her more than she could put into words. But it wasn't just Derek. It was the whole group, this strange, insular collective of kids who had somehow managed to carve out a space for themselves in a world that had never been designed for them. Rachel couldn't understand how they did it, how they managed to find strength in their difference. It was as though they had created a fortress, a barrier between themselves and the rest of the world, and nothing could touch them. They had something that Rachel didn't: a shared history, a sense of unity that transcended race and class, and that was something she could never have. And so the divide at Brookhaven Middle School continued. A silent war waged in the halls, in the cafeteria, in the classrooms. The students walked past each other every day, their eyes meeting only briefly, before they turned away and retreated into their own worlds. The divisions were unspoken, but they were there, as real as the air they breathed. Rachel had grown up in this world, and for a long time she had accepted it as the natural order of things. But as the days passed, as she watched Derek and his friends laugh, speak, and live in ways that seemed to defy the rules she had so carefully constructed, Rachel began to feel the first stirrings of something new, a sense of unease. A sense that the world she had so carefully built was not as stable as she thought. And the question began to haunt her: what if, just what if, everything she had been taught was wrong? Rachel Williams sat in the front row of the school assembly, her legs crossed beneath the hard plastic seat. The low hum of excited whispers filled the air, a dull roar that seemed to increase with each passing second as more students took their places. The gymnasium was packed, the air thick with the smell of old wood and faint sweat from the last basketball game. It was the annual Unity Week. Assembly, a day when the school pretended to celebrate diversity, to paint over the cracks in its divided social structure with colorful banners and cheerleading speeches. A day when every student was supposed to leave feeling like part of something greater, something whole. It was a day that should have been uneventful, just another obligatory event that would pass and fade like all the others. But Rachel had always known that Unity Week was a sham. She wasn't naive enough to believe that the assembly would change anything. The students, after all, would still sit in their segregated groups in the cafeteria. The black students, the few that spoke to each other with open warmth, would still gather at their tables with their own kind. The white kids, separated by their own private groups of privilege, would continue to ignore them. Rachel had grown used to this, even as she had begun to observe the small fractures in the world she had so carefully constructed. The assembly, in her eyes, was simply another exercise in pretending that the divide didn't exist, that the invisible barriers between the races were anything more than imaginary lines drawn in the sand. But then Derek showed up, as he always did, and this time something was different. He wasn't just sitting quietly among his friends. He was standing at the front of the gymnasium speaking to the crowd. His tall, lithe figure cut through the sea of students, his presence commanding attention without him even trying. He wasn't speaking for any reason that Rachel could immediately understand. He wasn't one of the students selected to give a speech about diversity, nor was he being recognized for his academic achievements. But he was up there, standing beside the principal, his face a mix of defiance and quiet confidence. Something about his posture, his easy, relaxed stance made Rachel's stomach churn with irritation. The assembly was supposed to be about celebrating differences, about creating an illusion of unity. The speakers, including the principal, had gone through the usual scripted speeches about inclusivity, equality, and shared values. They smiled broadly, their words dripping with rehearsed optimism, but Rachel's eyes kept drifting back to Derek. He wasn't listening to them. He was standing there with his arms crossed, a small but discernible smirk on his face, as if he knew exactly how hollow these words were. And something about that smirk, it wasn't just the casual, youthful arrogance that was so common in boys his age. It was something more. A quiet challenge, as if Derek was saying, without speaking, that he saw through the facade. For Rachel, it was unbearable. He wasn't just ignoring the assembly, he was mocking it. He was mocking everything she had been taught to respect. The unity, the togetherness, the very ideals that she had been raised to believe were sacred. There, in that moment, she felt the raw sting of humiliation, not because Derek was making fun of her specifically, but because his very existence in that room made a mockery of the entire system that she had worked so hard to uphold. The world she knew was being torn apart, piece by piece, and all she could do was watch it unravel. He was not just rejecting her world, he was dismantling it, in front of her eyes, and she had no power to stop him. The trigger, though, came later. It came during a question and answer portion of the assembly, something that was meant to give the students a voice, an opportunity to ask questions and make their concerns known. Rachel sat with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the stage, willing the moment to end. She could feel her pulse quicken, a strange, nauseating heat building in the pit of her stomach. Derek had been standing near the side of the stage, his group of friends gathered around him in a loose huddle, looking almost like a separate entity from the rest of the student body. When the microphone was passed to Derek, he didn't hesitate. His voice rang out loud and clear, cutting through the noise of the crowd, carrying an edge of pointed criticism. He wasn't asking a question, he was making a statement. The principal, who was in the middle of her annual unity speech, barely flinched as Derek's words filled the room. He wasn't speaking of peace or harmony. Instead, he asked, without any sense of hesitation, a simple but potent question that made the entire room go silent. "Why do we have to pretend?" Derek asked, his voice calm, but it carried weight. "Why do we keep pretending like we're all part of the same community when the truth is we're not? Why do we all sit in separate groups, walk around like the others aren't there, and act like everything's fine, if we're going to have Unity Week? Let's actually talk about it. Let's not just say words that mean nothing and go back to our cliques afterward. Let's do something real." Rachel could feel her skin crawl. She had always known that Unity Week was fake, that it was a ploy to smooth over the rough edges, to avoid confronting the hard truths about race and privilege that ran through the school like an invisible river, shaping everything in its wake. But to have it laid bare, to have someone so openly challenge the very fabric of the school's carefully constructed identity, felt like a slap in the face. The silence that followed Derek's words was thick with discomfort. Some students shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the truth of his words, while others nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if they had known all along but had been too afraid to say it out loud. Rachel's hands trembled. She could feel a deep, gnawing anger rise within her, twisting through her chest like a dark coil. The more she heard Derek speak, the more she felt this sudden, burning desire to push back, to prove him wrong, to show him that his challenge was not only misplaced but dangerous. Derek was threatening everything Rachel had known her whole life. He was questioning the status quo, and by doing so, he was questioning her. Derek wasn't the first to speak out in a way that made Rachel uncomfortable, but his words hit differently. He didn't just disagree with her perspective, he laid bare the truths she had been trained to ignore. And that terrified her. It was a revelation that was too close to home, too personal for Rachel to ignore. She had never considered the possibility that Derek and his friends, those students who had always been other, always outside her world, could have their own sense of unity, their own world, built on something she didn't understand. And now, as she sat there in front of everyone, Derek was calling it out. She clenched her fists harder, digging her nails into her palms, the sting grounding her in the moment. The anger swelled inside her, quick and hot, like a surge of electricity she couldn't control. How dare he? How dare he challenge everything her parents had taught her? How dare he make a mockery of her world and the world she had been told was right? The more she thought about it, the more furious she became. This wasn't just a challenge. This was an insult. An assault on her very way of life. As Derek finished speaking and handed the microphone back to the principal, a murmur rippled through the crowd. The principal, visibly flustered but unwilling to engage in any real confrontation, quickly moved on to the next topic. But Rachel wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was already racing, filled with thoughts so dark and twisted that they surprised even her. She couldn't let Derek get away with this. She couldn't let him or anyone challenge the world she had built in her head, the world where she was in control, where things made sense. Rachel had to act. She had to do something before the unease and rage inside her completely consumed her. The gymnasium, the voices, the questions, the entire assembly had all blurred into a haze around her. There was only one thing Rachel could focus on now: Derek, and the feeling in her gut that told her this was just the beginning. The days following Derek's challenge during the Unity Week assembly passed in a haze, an eerie quiet that seemed to blanket Rachel's mind. The usual routines continued: the classes, the lunch periods, the brief moments of whispered conversations between the popular kids, the normalcy of it all hanging like a thin veil. But underneath it all, there was a steady hum, a tension that Rachel couldn't shake. Her thoughts had taken on a sharp, almost obsessive quality, focusing on Derek, on his words, on his mocking smirk. It wasn't enough to simply feel anger anymore. Now it was something deeper, darker, a quiet rage that consumed her with each passing minute. The challenge Derek posed to her world, to the way she had always viewed everything, gnawed at her. It filled her with a burning need to correct what she saw as a wrong. He had dared to question her place. The hierarchy that she had been taught was inherent, inevitable. And she couldn't allow it to stand. Rachel began to replay that moment again and again in her mind, over and over until it became a dull, pounding rhythm in the back of her head. Derek standing tall, the way his friends had nodded in agreement, how he had made that statement so calmly, so assuredly, like it was the truth, the undeniable truth. His words hadn't just been a question, they were an accusation. He had accused Rachel's world of being false, of being a lie. And, at least in the moment, it was a lie that Rachel couldn't live with. The more she thought about it, the more she felt the urgency to fix it, to make everything right again. The problem was simple: Derek needed to be shown that his kind didn't belong. He needed to be made to understand the consequences of challenging the established order, of making a fool of her of them. It started with small things, almost imperceptible shifts in Rachel's behavior. She began to watch Derek more closely, where he went, who he hung out with, the patterns of his daily routine. She'd never really paid attention to him before, not like this. He was just another student at Brookhaven, someone who existed on the outskirts of her world, a shadow moving in the periphery. But now Derek became the center of Rachel's thoughts. Her gaze followed him in the hallways, tracked his movements during lunch. She memorized the times when he was alone, or when he would walk to his next class without his group of friends surrounding him. He had moments of vulnerability, moments when he wasn't surrounded by the safety of his peers. Those were the moments that Rachel began to wait for, to anticipate. Those were the moments when she could act. Rachel also started to test the waters with her own friends, probing their thoughts about Derek and his defiance. She asked leading questions, dropped subtle remarks to see how they felt about the assembly, about Unity Week, about the other kids at school. Some of her friends laughed off Derek's speech, pretending not to care. Others, like Sarah, rolled their eyes, dismissing it as a meaningless disruption. They didn't fully understand the depths of Rachel's fury, nor did they need to. They were content to dismiss it, to pretend that things would go back to normal. Rachel allowed them their ignorance, their fleeting comments. They were pawns, tools to be used, nothing more. They weren't part of the solution, but they didn't need to be. It was a late Wednesday afternoon when Rachel first made her move. The school day had ended, and the parking lot was emptying out, the last of the students trickling out in groups, leaving behind only the few stragglers, like Derek. Rachel had learned through observation that Derek usually stayed behind after class. It wasn't unusual for him to linger in the hallways, talking to friends, or sometimes alone, walking the empty corridors, his footsteps echoing off the linoleum tiles. It was in these moments that Rachel saw her opportunity. She had already decided that it would be tonight. There would be no more waiting, no more thinking. The longer she allowed Derek to remain, to continue being the thorn in her side, the more it felt like something inside her was dying. The only way to resolve it was to act, to make sure he understood exactly what happened to those who dared to disrupt the order of things. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she slipped through the back door of the school, moving as silently as possible. The hallways were dim, lit by the low buzz of fluorescent lights. There was no one else around, just her, the cold walls, and the quiet hum of the building. She had told her parents she was staying late to work on a school project, a convenient excuse that they had accepted without question. They never suspected anything, never bothered to check. They were too busy with their own lives to ask where Rachel was when she said she needed time alone. The silence of the school felt oddly comforting, almost suffocating in its stillness. The walls seemed to close in around her as she moved through them, every step echoing louder in the growing emptiness. Derek had been the last to leave his classroom, and she knew he would be heading for the back exit, the one closest to the parking lot. It was where he always went when he didn't feel like waiting around for a ride. Rachel had thought of everything. She had learned the exact time he would be walking out of the building, had memorized the minutes, the seconds, the rhythm of his steps. She had planned every detail. The heavy metal door at the back of the school would be unlocked. She had made sure of it earlier that week, testing the door during one of her earlier observations. She had learned his habits, his schedule. And now, as the minutes ticked closer to the time of reckoning, she could feel the weight of her thoughts settling over her like a cloak, comforting and suffocating at the same time. When Derek appeared, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the pale light outside, Rachel felt the blood rush to her head. He looked normal, relaxed, unaware of the trap she had laid for him. He was walking slowly, his hands in his pockets, humming to himself as he moved toward the door. But the moment he stepped through it, Rachel was there, stepping out from the shadows, her body tensed, ready for what was to come. Derek didn't see her at first. He was too focused on the fading sunlight, on the quiet of the parking lot. But the moment he heard her footsteps, he turned, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Rachel didn't wait for him to say anything. She lunged forward, her mind already set on the task at hand. In her hand, hidden inside her jacket sleeve, was a small, sharp object, something she had found in the school's janitor's closet. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Time seemed to slow as Derek's eyes widened in shock. He tried to step back, his expression morphing from confusion to fear in an instant, but Rachel was already upon him, the metal glinting in her hand. The first strike was quick, a sharp slice that caught him off guard. His shout of surprise echoed in the empty lot. But it was swallowed by the night, by the silence that hung like a thick, suffocating fog. Derek stumbled backward, clutching at his side, but Rachel was already moving, relentless, driven by something that was no longer fear, no longer uncertainty. This was something primal, something dark that had been building inside her for days, for weeks, for years. She struck again, and again. Each movement was fluid, each hit purposeful. The world around them seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them in that frozen moment, their lives on a collision course that Rachel had been planning for far too long. As Derek's body hit the ground, his breath shallow and ragged, Rachel stood over him, her chest heaving with adrenaline, her mind numb with the realization that it was done. The plan had been executed. The world that had once seemed so solid and unchangeable was now splintered, shattered by her actions. She stood there for a moment, staring down at him, her eyes cold, as though she had just completed an everyday task. There was no guilt, no regret. Just the cold satisfaction of knowing that she had done what needed to be done. And in that silence, as the last traces of Derek's breath left him, Rachel felt something shift inside her. Something dark, something final. This was only the beginning. The day of the attack arrived like any other. The school bell rang sharply at 8 a.m., signaling the beginning of another monotonous routine. Students flooded the hallways, the familiar murmur of voices rising and falling in waves as they shuffled to their respective classrooms. The low hum of activity filled the air, but Rachel didn't notice. She was already deep inside herself, lost in the shadows of her own thoughts, waiting for the moment that would change everything. Today wasn't like any other day for her. Today, the mask of normalcy that had shielded the ugly truths of her mind for so long would crack, and she would be free. The weight of her plan pressed down on her like a heavy stone, but Rachel was calm, unnervingly so. The uncertainty, the trepidation that might have paralyzed someone else, was absent from her mind. All she could feel was the cold certainty of her purpose, the sharp focus that had taken root in her mind for weeks. The moment she had been waiting for was finally here. She had envisioned this day 1,000 times, replayed every detail, every movement. There would be no mistakes. Her classes went by in a blur. Teachers droned on about history and math, their words barely registering as Rachel's mind stayed fixated on the plan, ticking down the seconds in her head. Every time she passed Derek in the halls, when he laughed with his friends or exchanged pleasantries with others, she felt that familiar rush of adrenaline course through her veins. He had no idea what was coming. The thought of his obliviousness only heightened her anticipation. It was almost laughable, how he moved through the world like everything was normal, unaware that he was walking toward the end of it. It was during the lunch period when Rachel's pulse began to quicken. The cafeteria, as usual, was divided into groups, each clique clustering around tables that matched their social lines. The air was thick with the sound of plastic trays clattering, the scrape of metal utensils against plate, and the endless chatter that never seemed to stop. Rachel sat with her usual friends, but her mind was elsewhere. She barely tasted the food in front of her, a cold sandwich and a half-eaten apple. She barely even looked at the others around her. Instead, her eyes wandered to Derek's table, where he sat with his friends. There was a moment of stillness, a brief lull in the noise, and in that moment, Rachel's gaze locked onto Derek. He was laughing, his face animated with joy as his friends around him joked. For a moment, Rachel was struck by the ease with which he existed in the world. He moved like everything was fine, like he hadn't just shaken the foundations of her entire existence. The bitterness inside Rachel grew, blooming like a dark flower, each petal unfurling with new intensity. There was no more waiting. The hour was almost at hand. The anger, the cold fury, that had been building for so long in her chest was ready to explode. It would start with him, it would end with him. Everything that had led up to this moment, all the quiet watching, the careful planning, would come to fruition now. After lunch, the school day dragged on. Every tick of the clock felt like a hammer striking the anvil, each second louder than the last. Rachel's fingers clenched into tight fists beneath the desk as she sat in her afternoon classes. She hardly heard the lesson, her mind already far away. The final bell for the day would ring soon. It would signal the beginning of her act of finality, the moment when she would tear down the world that had been built around her. The last class ended, and the hallway outside the classroom emptied quickly. Students spilled out into the corridors, some heading to the buses, others to their after-school activities. It was the perfect time. The building was clearing out, but there were still a few stragglers, those who lingered, as Derek often did. Rachel knew he would be in the same routine, heading for the back exit, walking slowly as if nothing could touch him. She had timed it down to the second. The halls would be empty, the space hers for the taking. No one would stop her. She moved with purpose, her steps light, but sure. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she wasn't afraid. She wasn't nervous. She was ready. The air felt thick with anticipation, and Rachel's breath came in shallow bursts as she made her way toward the back door. The darkened halls were eerily silent, the usual buzz of students a distant memory. As she neared the exit, she could already see Derek in the distance, his broad shoulders visible just beyond the threshold, his silhouette framed by the fading light of the afternoon. He was walking slowly, not in a hurry, not at all aware of what was about to unfold. It felt surreal, like stepping into a dream where everything was moving in slow motion. The building seemed to stretch out before her, each step growing heavier as she approached the moment that would change everything. Rachel's hand brushed the cold metal door handle, and she pushed it open, stepping into the fading light of the parking lot. The air was thick with the humidity of Florida's late spring, but it didn't bother her. There was only one thing on her mind now, only one person. Derek turned his head, his eyes catching the movement of Rachel's figure in the doorway. For a moment his gaze locked with hers, and she could see the faintest flicker of recognition pass across his face. It was the smallest of moments, nothing significant, nothing that would suggest anything was amiss. But in that split second, Rachel felt a chill run through her, a flicker of doubt that made her chest tighten. It was nothing. Just a fleeting hesitation. He would never see it coming. He couldn't. Rachel didn't wait for him to speak, to ask why she was out there. There was no time for explanations, no time for words. She moved swiftly, closing the gap between them in a matter of seconds. Before Derek could react, before he could make sense of what was happening, Rachel was on him. She pushed him hard, sending him stumbling backward into the asphalt. He barely had time to react before she was on top of him, her body pressing down on his as she grabbed the small, sharp object from her jacket pocket. The cold metal felt right in her hand, the weight of it comforting. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. Her actions were instinctual now, a cold, detached rhythm she had practiced over and over in her mind. She struck once, then twice, the quick, controlled movements like a dance she had learned long ago. Derek's startled gasp filled the air, but it was drowned out by the pounding of her heart in her ears. His attempts to push her off were weak, sluggish. He didn't understand. He couldn't. The world Rachel had been living in, the one where things were in their proper place, was shattering around her, and there was nothing she could do but finish what she had started. She wasn't even sure how many times she had struck him before he stopped moving, before he went still beneath her. All that mattered was that it was done. As the world around her seemed to recede into the distance, Rachel rose from Derek's body, her breath shallow but controlled. The parking lot, the empty hallways, the school, everything felt distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. She had crossed a line, and nothing would ever be the same again. But that was the point, wasn't it? To break the world she had known, to destroy the order that had held her captive for so long. She stood over him, her chest heaving as she looked down at the mess she had created. The blood, so much of it was pooling around his body, staining the pavement. For a moment she felt nothing, no remorse, no regret. Just a cold emptiness, the satisfaction of knowing that she had taken control. Derek was gone, his challenge ended, and now the world would see that Rachel Williams was in charge. The darkness inside her had been unleashed, and there was no going back, but that wasn't enough. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The aftermath of what Rachel had done hung heavy in the air. The silence felt suffocating, as if the world around her had gone still, holding its breath. Derek's body lay sprawled in the parking lot, lifeless, blood pooling around him, a grotesque testament to the violence she had unleashed. She stood there, watching, unmoving, as the reality of what she had just committed began to seep into her consciousness. But there was no fear, no regret. Only the eerie quiet that seemed to swallow the sounds of the world, as though nothing mattered now except the stillness. Rachel turned away from the scene, the weight of her actions pressing against her chest, but she felt no compulsion to hurry. She moved with cold precision, her feet carrying her farther from the blood-soaked ground. It was done. There was no turning back now. The rush of adrenaline was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a deep, unsettling emptiness. But Rachel knew one thing for certain: the world had shifted. Her world, at least. And there would be no going back to what it once was.